Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, this story today that I've read, I mean, I've read some crazy stories in the past 12 months, but this one really takes the biscuit. A middle-aged father discriminated against by the NHS because they rejected him for a job, even though he was the best qualified, because apparently they thought he wouldn't fit in with his younger female colleagues.
That's right. I mean, you couldn't make these things up anymore. It's like No Country for Old Men. This is No Country for
True.
middle-aged white men anymore. And yeah, as you say, he went for this job with the NHS, and he was told that he wouldn't fit in with the youngish, mostly millennial women who worked in that kind of area. And that is a form of discrimination. And the great irony here is, of course, that kind of thing used to be said to women.
Yeah.
Women used to be told, this workplace isn't right for you. There's too much rough and tumble.
Right.
You might hear swear words. You might see things you don't like. There was a very patronizing approach to women in the past, of course, in relation to the workplace. It's not progressive to now switch that onto middle-aged blokes and say, well, you won't fit in here and therefore you can't have the job.
Well, this is one of the things that over the past 12 months as well, I've had conversations with several kind of people who listen to this show, middle-aged guys and women, to be fair, who say, look, if we lose our jobs right now, we're not very confident of getting another one, because it's not very, shall we say, trendy to employ 50-something-year-old men to work in companies where there might be lots of other young people around who are so snowflakey that they can't even sort of stand at a coffee machine without being offended if you're standing next to them.
That's right. And there's all this talk now about generational divides, but I think there's a real culture of generationalism, prejudice against certain generations.
Yeah.
The older you get, then the more useless and prejudiced people will assume that you are. And I think that's reflected in the workplace. There is now a growing trend of saying that certain age groups, particularly if you're a man, if you have an old-fashioned way of thinking, or if you used old-fashioned words, those people are now seen as being unacceptable in the workplace. I read recently that old men are not liked in the workplace anymore because they use words like darling and doll and sonny. They refer to young men as sonny, and these are apparently offensive words. My first job was in a warehouse, and the old blokes there spoke in those kinds of words all the time. Nobody was offended. The women would come in from the office. They got called darling. They were treated incredibly nicely. That's how some people speak. That's how some people think. They're not being hateful. They're not being prejudiced. This is just normal, everyday speech. So I'm worried about the hostility of contemporary workplaces to people of a certain age.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, one of the more amusing pieces of the evidence from the hearing, because this guy's actually won his case and won several £1,000s in compensation, so it proves that the NHS was actually in the wrong here. He was described as maybe too experienced for the job.
Yeah. Too good for the job. We can't possibly have you. Maybe there were other things going on here, but as you say, it seems that the NHS definitely did behave in a discriminatory way, judging by the ruling and the payout. But the fact is, there's a broader culture now which problematizes older white men. I mean, they are held responsible for every ill in our society. The way people talk about white men in particular now is they do so with extreme hostility. You see it in the media, you see it among millennials. White man has become a pejorative phrase. If you're a white man, you're a bad person. If you're white, you were born with original sin.
Yes.
You're privileged, you're probably racist. And the point is, this culture is bound to influence on how younger people view middle-aged and older white men. They're bound to start viewing them as a problem. So we really do have to tackle the broader politics of identity, which paints certain groups as being problematic, especially older white blokes.
Although, bizarrely, the one older white bloke that doesn't seem to suffer from any of this prejudice is Jeremy Corbyn, who they all love. I can't quite get my head around that one.
Yeah, there's always allowances are made for certain supposedly good old white men. Jeremy Corbyn. Another one, of course, is Joe Biden. I mean, the Joe Biden situation cracks me up. This is someone who just a few months ago, feminists were calling him a predator. They were saying that he's an old white male. He does terrible things to young women, allegedly. And now they're all celebrating him as the great savior of the Western world who is defeating evil Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So they do make allowances for certain old white blokes
Well, I was
if
just
they
saying,
have
yeah,
the
I
right
was I
belief.
was just saying that the kind of dichotomy of all of these things is as I was just saying to Sebastian Gorka, that they absolutely lionize Barack Obama as the king of the peacemakers and the Nobel Prize winner, and Donald Trump as the king of the warmongers. Trump never went to war at all. Obama bombed half the world during the 8 years he was in the White House. You know, it's just there is no grip on reality.
No grip at all. There's an extraordinary double standard. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, whether you like Trump or dislike Trump, he was the first president in decades who didn't start a new war. He did want to get America out of the wars that had been started by Obama and Bush
Yeah.
and cheered on by Hillary Clinton and others. So this double standard is really striking because, as you say, Barack Obama is celebrated as the saint of peace, the
Yeah.
most wonderful leader the free world has ever had. But in fact, he dropped a huge number of bombs on at least 7 countries, whereas Trump at least wanted to get out of those conflicts. So, yeah, there's double standards riddled inside of this kind of identity politics approach.
There is, and also what the other thing this story tells us is about what's going on inside the NHS, because we know, of course, about all of the people that were supposed to be helping out when the recruitment drive started during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it turned out that nobody had actually been hired because they all had to fill out a diversity form or prove that they'd had some kind of lessons in diversity and fairness in order to actually go and carry some trays around inside a hospital. This guy was going for a job which was detailed as a project manager, 40 grand a year, helping the health service to adapt technology more quickly. I mean, imagine how many people are doing those jobs inside the NHS.
It's the thing is, it's the amount of red tape in the NHS at the moment is really extraordinary, and it's no longer just the health and safety red tape. Health and safety is necessary sometimes, especially in a national health service. But there's now all this identitarian red tape. You
Yeah.
have to jump through all these diversity hoops. You have to prove that you speak in the correct language, that you have the correct thoughts. This is now becoming a real barrier, not simply for some people getting a job that they want, but also it's becoming a barrier to things like rolling out the vaccine or assisting ill people during a crisis like the COVID crisis, because we're constantly being told, well, you have to be background checked, we have to make sure that you're politically correct, we have to make sure that you've had the diversity training. All that stuff needs to be scrapped. We need a culture of trust, especially in a time of crisis like the one we have right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like the old McCarthy hearings, isn't it? You know, have you now or were you ever in any way derogatory about somebody who you may have discriminated against? I mean, it's almost an impossibility to have not done that at some point in your life, right?
Yeah, well, I've often thought that we're living in an era of woke McCarthyism,
Yeah,
and we
totally.
can see that in relation to not only the pressure that is put on everyone to think in the correct identitarian woke fashion, but also the current purge of the internet of anyone who ever supported Donald Trump or expressed support for Donald Trump, the way in which any journalist in the UK or the US, whoever it said anything remotely favorable about him, is now being hounded out of polite society, essentially. Some people are drawing up blacklists. You know, Forbes magazine says it will not take seriously anyone who ever worked for Trump who tries to get a job in the future. I mean, that's blacklisting. That is a form of
Yes.
McCarthyism. So
And
I think
I know people who worked for the Brexit Party who have had that experience in this country as well.
yeah, so the political intolerance and the desire to purge supposed undesirables from public life, that's really intensifying at the moment. It's intensifying, especially since the breach of the Capitol building a few days ago, but it's been growing for a long time. And I think it's going to give rise to a very stifling, conformist, intolerant culture.
It really is. And what do you think about the future for social media in this country, Brendan? Because obviously you guys are very active on social media. You're out there on the internet. Do you see it becoming even more sort of narrow, if you like, in terms of what views they will entertain or will allow people to entertain? Or do you see like a second wave of social media companies starting up, which might be considered to be right-wing or more right-wing, but which will be more sort of freedom-based, if you like?
Yeah, I'm really worried about the state of social media at the moment because social media, the social side of the internet, this is essentially the public square of the 21st century. This is where public discussion happens. This is where politicians communicate with voters and with followers. And it is controlled by corporations. It's controlled by these vast Silicon Valley oligarchies, and decisions are made by tiny handfuls of people that none of us ever voted for. They can switch you off with a click of a finger, and you no longer have access to this democratic forum. So I'm very worried about that. But what worries me most is what's happened to Parler. So Parler is the libertarian alternative to Twitter. People, whenever I complain about Twitter and Facebook, people always say, well, set up your own social media platform. That's all you need to do.
Right.
Well, that's what Parler did.
Right.
And they have now been essentially switched off by the corporate controllers of the internet. So even setting up an alternative platform is becoming difficult. I think people are being very foolish if they cheer on this corporate colonization of public debate. We need free debate, and we need to hear all voices, not just the ones that Silicon Valley approve of.
Yes, and also not just the ones that you and I approve of, because, I mean, you know, we may be many things, but, you know, I don't care whether you disagree with me or not. In fact, I'd rather you did once in a while, because I quite like arguing with people. But at the end of the day, I don't want to stop somebody from saying something, but they do.
That's exactly right. And I think it's really important that people who are not on that side of politics show how it's done and defend freedom of speech, even for people we disagree with. Because, of course, that's the whole point of freedom of speech. The whole point is that you fight for it for everyone, regardless of whether you like them or not. I mean, Noam Chomsky gets lots of things wrong, but he's right about one thing. He said even Stalin and Goebbels were in favor of freedom of speech for people they agreed with. That's not difficult at all.
Right.
The difficulty is supporting freedom of speech for people who you dislike, disagree with, and sometimes even hate. That's the test. And I think everyone needs to start doing that, defending freedom of speech across the board, because if one person loses it, then all of us are in trouble.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Very good message to end with. Brendan, thanks very much indeed. Brendan O'Neill there on the story of freedom of speech partly, but also just massive discrimination against a middle-aged white guy who couldn't get a job at the NHS because the people who were hiring thought he might not get along very well with some of his younger female colleagues. He might be considered to be a bit too past it. He might offend them. He might say something that was wrong. He might not know what they were talking about. I mean, honestly, you really do wonder who on earth is put in charge of these organisations. How they get those jobs is beyond me. But clearly, if you are a white middle-aged man in this world, and people talk about this all the time, white privilege, right? You put a white middle-aged man in front of the BBC, you see if he gets hired, because it wouldn't happen. I guarantee you that.